The sun was setting over the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Willow Creek, Texas, casting a golden glow over the rows of pristine houses. It was a peaceful evening, the kind where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. Jamal Thompson, a 32-year-old software engineer, stood in the driveway of his new home, unloading boxes from a rented moving truck. He had just closed on the house a week ago, and this was his first day moving in. It was a milestone he had worked tirelessly for, a symbol of his success and determination. Jamal wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at the house. It was a modest two-story home with a freshly painted white exterior and a small garden in the front. To him, it was perfect. He had chosen this neighborhood because of its reputation for being family-friendly and safe. What he didn't know was that his presence would soon disrupt the fragile peace of Willow Creek. As Jamal carried a box toward the house, he noticed a woman standing across the street, watching him intently. She was in her mid-40s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a sharp expression. Her arms were crossed, and her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized him. Jamal offered a polite smile and a nod, hoping to break the ice. "Good evening," he said, his voice warm and friendly. The woman didn't return the smile. Instead, she took a few steps closer, her high heels clicking against the pavement. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone icy. Jamal paused, setting the box down on the driveway. "Oh no, thank you. I'm just moving in. I'm Jamal, by the way. Nice to meet you." He extended his hand, but the woman didn't take it. "Moving in?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "This house has been empty for months. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Jamal chuckled nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "Yes, I'm sure. I just bought it last week. I'm excited to finally be here." The woman's eyes narrowed further, and she took another step forward, her gaze sweeping over him from head to toe. Jamal suddenly felt self-conscious, acutely aware of his sweat-stained shirt and the dirt on his hands. He straightened up, trying to appear more confident. "I don't recall seeing you around here before," she said, her tone accusatory. "This is a very close-knit community. We look out for each other." "Well, I'm looking forward to being part of it," Jamal replied, forcing another smile. "I'm sure we'll get to know each other better soon." The woman didn't seem convinced. She glanced at the moving truck, then back at Jamal, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You know, we've had some issues with break-ins lately. People pretending to be residents, scoping out the neighborhood. It's been very concerning." Jamal's smile faltered. He could feel the weight of her words, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. "I understand your concern," he said carefully, "but I assure you, I'm not here to cause any trouble. This is my home." The woman scoffed, her arms tightening across her chest. "That's what they all say. But we can't be too careful, can we?" Jamal took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had dealt with this kind of prejudice before, but it never got easier. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to move into my new house. If you'd like, I can show you my ID or the paperwork." She waved a hand dismissively. "I don't need to see anything. I just think it's strange that someone like you would be living here." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. He clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. "Someone like me?" he repeated, his voice tight. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if realizing she had gone too far, but then doubled down. "You know what I mean. This isn't the kind of neighborhood where people like you usually live." Jamal felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're implying, but I have every right to be here. I worked hard for this house, and I'm not going to let anyone make me feel unwelcome." The woman's face flushed with anger. "We'll see about that," she snapped, pulling out her phone. Before Jamal could react, she dialed 911. "Hello, I need to report a suspicious person," she said, her voice loud and deliberate. "There's a man here who claims to be moving into a house on Willow Lane, but I don't believe him. He's not from around here." Jamal stared at her in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe this was happening. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm just trying to move into my own house." The woman ignored him, continuing her conversation with the dispatcher. "Yes, he's still here. He's getting aggressive. Please send someone right away." Jamal took a step back, his mind racing. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the thought of dealing with the police in this situation filled him with dread. He had heard too many stories of black men being harassed or worse by law enforcement, and he didn't want to become another statistic. As the woman hung up the phone, she glared at him triumphantly. "They're on their way. We'll see how long you last here." Jamal didn't respond. He turned and walked back to the moving truck, his hands shaking. He needed to calm down, to think clearly. He grabbed his phone and quickly texted his best friend, Marcus, who lived a few towns over. "Man, you won't believe what's happening. My new neighbor just called the cops on me for moving into my own house." Marcus's reply came almost instantly. "What? Are you serious? Do you need me to come over?" Jamal hesitated. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also didn't want to face the police alone. "Yeah, if you can. I don't know how this is going to go." As he waited for Marcus, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He had been so excited to start this new chapter of his life, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. He glanced at the woman, who was still standing across the street, her arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. "You have no idea what you've just started," Jamal muttered under his breath. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a chain of events that would expose the dark underbelly of Willow Creek and change his life forever. The sound of sirens pierced the quiet evening air, growing louder with each passing second. Jamal's heart raced as he watched the flashing lights of a police cruiser turn onto Willow Lane. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had nothing to hide, but the thought of being questioned by the police in front of his new neighbors made his stomach churn. The cruiser pulled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a stern expression. The other was a younger woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. They approached Jamal cautiously, their hands resting on their belts. "Evening," the male officer said, his tone neutral. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the area. Can you tell us what's going on here?" Before Jamal could respond, the woman from across the street, Karen, as he would later learn her name, stepped forward, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "That's him," she exclaimed. "He's been loitering around, claiming he lives here, but I've never seen him before, and I know everyone in this neighborhood. He's clearly up to no good." Jamal clenched his fists, trying to keep his anger in check. "Officers, my name is Jamal Thompson. I just bought this house, and I'm in the process of moving in. I have all the paperwork to prove it." The female officer nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Do you have any identification on you, sir?" "Yes, of course," Jamal said, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and the closing documents for the house. The officers examined them carefully, their eyes flicking between the papers and Jamal. Karen, however, wasn't satisfied. "Those could be fake," she insisted. "You can't just take his word for it. This neighborhood has been targeted by criminals before. We can't afford to be careless." The male officer held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, we'll handle this. Please step back." Karen huffed but complied, crossing her arms and glaring at Jamal from a distance. The female officer handed Jamal's documents back to him. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Thompson. We're sorry for the inconvenience." Jamal let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, officers. I appreciate it." But Karen wasn't ready to let it go. "You're just going to take his word for it?" she demanded. "What if he's lying? What if he's planning something?" The male officer turned to her, his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am, we verified his identity and his ownership of the property. There's no reason to detain him further. If you have any additional concerns, you can file a report at the station." Karen's face turned red with frustration, but she didn't say anything else. The officers gave Jamal a final nod before returning to their cruiser and driving off. As the sirens faded into the distance, Jamal turned to Karen. his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Are you happy now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You called the police on me for no reason. Do you have any idea how dangerous that could have been?" Karen sneered at him. "I was just looking out for my community. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about." Jamal shook his head, too exhausted to argue further. He turned and walked back to the moving truck, his mind racing. He couldn't believe he had to deal with this kind of prejudice in his own neighborhood. As he resumed unloading the truck, Jamal noticed something strange. The front door of his house was slightly ajar, even though he was sure he had closed it earlier. He frowned, setting down the box he was carrying and approaching the door cautiously. "Hello?" he called out, pushing the door open further. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. Jamal stepped inside, his heart pounding. The living room was just as he had left it, but something felt off. He walked down the hallway, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. When he reached the bedroom, his blood ran cold. The window was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The room had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, clothes strewn about, and his laptop missing from the desk. "What the hell?" Jamal muttered, his mind racing. He quickly checked the rest of the house, but there was no sign of the intruders. They were long gone. He pulled out his phone and called the police again, this time to report the break-in. As he waited for them to arrive, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a random burglary. When the officers returned, Jamal explained what had happened. They took his statement and examined the broken window, but there wasn't much they could do without leads. "We'll file a report and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity in the area," the female officer said. "In the meantime, you might want to consider installing a security system." Jamal nodded, though he knew that wouldn't be enough. He needed answers. After the officers left, Jamal remembered the security camera he had installed earlier that day. It was a small, discreet device mounted above the front door, meant to monitor the driveway. He quickly pulled up the footage on his phone, his heart racing as he fast-forwarded through the recordings. What he saw made his blood boil. The footage showed two young men, both white, wearing hoodies and masks, breaking into his house through the bedroom window. They moved quickly, ransacking the room and grabbing whatever they could carry. But what caught Jamal's attention was a small detail. One of the intruders was wearing a distinctive bracelet with a logo that Jamal recognized. It was the emblem of Willow Creek High School, the same school Karen's son attended. Jamal's mind raced as he connected the dots. Karen's hostility, her insistence that he didn't belong in the neighborhood, the timing of the break-in. It all pointed to something much darker than he had initially realized. He grabbed his phone and called Marcus, who had just arrived at the house. "You're not going to believe this," Jamal said, his voice shaking with anger. "I think my neighbor's son might be involved in the break-in." Marcus's eyes widened. "Are you serious? What are you going to do?" Jamal took a deep breath, his mind made up. "I'm going to find out the truth. And when I do, Karen's going to wish she never called the cops on me." As the sun set over Willow Creek, Jamal knew that the battle for his home and his dignity was far from over. The secrets of the neighborhood were beginning to unravel, and he was determined to expose them, no matter the cost. The night was quiet, but Jamal's mind was anything but still. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the security footage on his laptop. The grainy video played on a loop, showing the two masked intruders breaking into his home. His eyes were fixed on the bracelet one of them wore, a silver band with the unmistakable logo of Willow Creek High School. Jamal leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He had spent the last hour researching the school's emblem, confirming that the bracelet was indeed part of the school's merchandise. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to make his suspicions grow. Karen's son, Jason, was a student there. Could he be involved? The thought made Jamal's stomach churn. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces were starting to fit together. Karen's hostility, her insistence that he didn't belong in the neighborhood, the timing of the break-in. It all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple burglary. Jamal knew he needed more evidence before he could confront Karen or go to the police. He decided to dig deeper, The next morning, Jamal called in sick to work. He had more pressing matters to attend to. He started by reviewing the footage again, this time paying closer attention to the intruders' movements. They were young, probably in their late teens or early 20s, and they moved with the confidence of someone who knew the area well. Jamal also noticed something else. One of the intruders had a distinct limp, favoring his right leg. It was a small detail, but it could be crucial. He made a mental note of it and began searching for any reports of similar break-ins in the neighborhood. A quick online search revealed that Willow Creek had indeed been targeted by a string of burglaries over the past few months. The victims were all new residents, and most of them were people of color. The police had dismissed the incidents as random crimes, but Jamal wasn't so sure. He decided to reach out to some of the victims. It wasn't easy. Many of them were reluctant to talk, fearing retaliation or further harassment. But after a few phone calls, Jamal managed to connect with a woman named Maria, who had been targeted just a month earlier. "They took everything," Maria said, her voice trembling. "My jewelry, my laptop, even my son's video games. The police said there wasn't much they could do, but I always felt like it was personal, you know? Like they were watching us." Jamal's heart sank. "Did you notice anything unusual before the break-in? Anyone acting suspicious?" Maria hesitated. "There was this woman. She lived across the street. She kept staring at us, like she was judging us or something. One day, she even called the cops on my husband for parking in our own driveway. Said he looked suspicious." Jamal's jaw tightened. It was the same pattern, Karen targeting new residents, creating tension, and then their homes being burglarized. Couldn't be a coincidence. Later that afternoon, Jamal decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He needed to clear his head, but he also wanted to see if he could spot anything or anyone that might confirm his suspicions. As he passed Karen's house, he noticed a young man sitting on the porch. He was tall and lanky, with blonde hair and a bored expression. Jamal recognized him from the photos Karen had posted on social media. It was Jason, her son. Jamal's eyes immediately went to Jason's wrist. There it was, the silver bracelet with the Willow Creek High logo. But that wasn't all. As Jason stood up to go inside, Jamal noticed something else. A slight limp in his right leg. His heart raced. It was him. Jason was one of the intruders. Jamal quickly pulled out his phone and pretended to check a text, snapping a few discreet photos of Jason. He needed proof, something concrete he could take to the police. But as he walked away, Jamal realized that confronting Karen or going to the authorities wasn't enough. He needed to expose the entire operation, to show that this wasn't just about one break-in. It was a pattern of harassment and theft targeting people like him. That evening, Jamal decided to pay Karen a visit. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers. Karen answered the door with her usual scowl. "What do you want?" she demanded, crossing her arms. "We need to talk," Jamal said, his voice steady. "About what happened last night." Karen rolled her eyes. "I already told you. I was just looking out for the neighborhood. If you don't like it, maybe you should move somewhere else." Jamal took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. "This isn't about me. It's about your son." Karen's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "What about him?" "I have security footage of the break-in," Jamal said, holding up his phone. "It shows two people breaking into my house. One of them was wearing a bracelet from Willow Creek High, and he had a limp." Karen's face turned pale. "That doesn't prove anything," she snapped, but her voice wavered. "Maybe not," Jamal admitted. "But I also know that there have been other break-ins in this neighborhood, all targeting new residents. And every time you were there, stirring up trouble, calling the cops on people for no reason. It's almost like you were scouting for your son and his friends." Karen's eyes widened in panic. "You have no proof." "I have enough," Jamal said firmly. "And if you don't come clean, I'll take it to the police. They might not have believed me before, but they'll listen now." For a moment, Karen looked like she might argue. But then her shoulders slumped and she let out a shaky breath. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered. "Jason, he's a good kid. He just got mixed up with the wrong crowd." Jamal's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "You knew," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You knew what he was doing, and you let it happen." Karen didn't respond, but the guilt in her eyes was answer enough. Jamal left Karen's house with a heavy heart. He had the truth, but it didn't bring him any satisfaction. Instead, he felt a deep sense of betrayal not just by Karen, but by the entire system that had allowed this to happen. The next morning, he went to the police station with the security footage, photos of Jason, and a list of the other break-ins. The officers were hesitant at first, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. By the end of the day, Jason and his accomplice were in custody. Karen, meanwhile, was facing charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The neighborhood was in shock, and Jamal found himself at the center of a media storm. But as he sat in his living room that night, surrounded by boxes he still hadn't unpacked, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice and for his place in Willow Creek was far from over. The news of Jason's arrest and Karen's involvement in the burglary ring spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. The quiet, picturesque neighborhood was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, and residents were forced to confront the ugly truth that had been festering beneath the surface. Jamal, however, found little comfort in the chaos. He had exposed the truth, but the cost had been high. His new home no longer felt like a sanctuary, it was a constant reminder of the prejudice and betrayal he had faced. Still, he knew he couldn't back down now. This was about more than just him, it was about holding people accountable and ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had. The days following the arrests were a whirlwind of activity. Reporters camped out on the street, eager to get a statement from Jamal. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, some expressing sympathy while others defended Karen and Jason, claiming they had been misunderstood. Jamal kept a low profile, focusing on repairing the damage to his home and his sense of security. He installed a state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras and motion sensors. He also reached out to the other victims of the burglaries, offering his support and encouraging them to come forward. Together, they formed a coalition determined to hold the police and the community accountable for allowing the crimes to go unchecked for so long. They organized a town hall meeting, inviting local officials, law enforcement, and residents to discuss the systemic issues that had enabled the harassment and theft. The meeting was held in the Willow Creek Community Center, a small building that had never seen so many people packed into its modest space. Jamal stood at the front of the room, flanked by Maria and the other victims. The air was thick with tension as he addressed the crowd. "I moved to Willow Creek because I thought it was a safe, welcoming community," Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But what I found was something very different. I was targeted because of the color of my skin, and when I tried to defend myself, I was treated like the criminal." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the fact that people like Karen and Jason felt entitled to harass and steal from their neighbors and that no one stopped them. It's about the fact that the police didn't take these crimes seriously until it was too late." The room was silent as Jamal continued, detailing the pattern of harassment and theft that had plagued the neighborhood. He showed the security footage of the break-in, along with photos of Jason and his accomplice. He also shared the stories of the other victims, many of whom had been too afraid to speak out before. By the time he finished, the mood in the room had shifted. Some residents looked ashamed, while others were visibly angry, not at Jamal, but at the system that had failed them. Karen, meanwhile, was facing the consequences of her actions. She had been charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. Her attempts to defend herself only made things worse. In a desperate bid to salvage her reputation, Karen gave an interview to a local news outlet, claiming that she had been trying to protect her son and that she never meant for things to go this far. But her excuses fell flat, and the public backlash was swift. Her once pristine reputation was in tatters. Neighbors who had once admired her now avoided her, and her social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. Even her closest friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her crimes. Jason, too, was facing the consequences of his actions. He had been charged with multiple counts of burglary and was looking at significant jail time. His future, once so bright, was now uncertain. As the weeks passed, the media frenzy died down and life in Willow Creek began to return to normal, or at least, a new kind of normal. The community had been shaken, but it had also been forced to confront its flaws and take steps to address them. The police department launched an internal investigation into its handling of the burglaries, and several officers were reprimanded for their negligence. The town council also implemented new policies to promote diversity and inclusion, including sensitivity training for law enforcement and community leaders. For Jamal, the fight was far from over, but he felt a sense of closure. He had stood up for himself and for others, and in doing so, he had sparked a much-needed conversation about race, privilege, and justice. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Marcus joined him. "You did it, man," Marcus said, clapping him on the back. "You took on the system and won." Jamal smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "It's not over," he said, "but it's a start." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was his home now, and he was determined to make it a better place for everyone. The road ahead would be long, but Jamal knew he wasn't alone. He had found allies in the most unexpected places, and together they would continue to fight for justice and equality. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jamal realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along, a sense of belonging.